Hey guys, this is JC on a bike. This is a coronavirus special report, but not about the origins of the coronavirus. I got that nailed pretty well. This is about moving forward. How can we use vaccines? How can we use antibodies? What is convalescent plasma therapy? And what is antibody-dependent enhancement of viral infection? All of these concepts are important to understand as we move forward, because as the talking heads on the television and in social media continue to push this idea of vaccination, it's important that we, as informed biologists, understand the pros and cons of the vaccination system in America, and very specifically understand the pros and cons of vaccinating against coronaviruses. There are many different things that happen in the course of vaccination. One of the things that can happen is that your body can make antibodies which actually enhance the second infection rather than prevent the second infection. It's the opposite of immunity. We need to understand this if we're going to understand the subtle myths that are being told about how we're going to have a vaccine for the coronavirus in, let's say, 11 to 15 months. Join me on the ride, the review afterward. Thanks for watching. Good evening, Pittsburgh and Universe. This is JC on a bike. My name is JC and this is Journal Club on a Bike. Journal Club on a Bike this evening is going to be kind of a review about different subjects related to the coronavirus and our collective understanding of how we're going to get through this together. Specifically, I want to address the many possibilities for how we can combat this with modern medicine. I want to talk about vaccines and antibodies, because the average human being doesn't know very much about antibodies and vaccines, and I think the average human being has such a poor understanding of how vaccines and antibodies work that we can draw poor conclusions about how to move forward with our limited biological understanding. So let's just get right down to it. What are antibodies? Antibodies are protein molecules that are generated by your immune system as sort of specific tags. And they're specific tags for pathogens. And essentially what they do is they hang around in your blood and they attach to the thing that they are specific for. And once they attach to that thing, generally speaking, that tag indicates that they should be phagocytosed or removed. And so for bacteria, antibodies can label the bacteria for attack by the immune system. And so the same thing is thought to happen with viruses, that we make antibodies in response to the epitopes. An epitope is just simply the physical manifestation of a molecule that can be recognized by another molecule. It's like a puzzle piece, plus and minus. And so oftentimes when we talk about viruses and bacteria having epitopes, it depends on what particular part of the bacteria or viral coat that you look at. That postman that I just drove by could be considered to have several epitopes. He's got an epitope that's specific for his face, and he's got an epitope that's specific for his postman outfit, and he's got an epitope for his shoes. And so if we made antibodies for his postman outfit, then those antibodies would cross-react with other postmen, and so that if we had antibodies that were anti-postman in Pittsburgh, then that guy would be covered with them and the police would come and get him. It's a horrible analogy, but it kind of helps if you're really not very biologically inclined, which I think most of us are at this stage. If you've been watching TV your whole life, you don't know anything about biology unless you've tried to learn it. It's not to fault anyone, it's just to say that knowledge is no longer given away for free. And we don't want an informed public thinking about vaccinations and about drugs, because then the informed public would understand the extent to which the pharmaceutical industry and big pharma is taking advantage of us. Now I'm going to start here on this ride by saying right now that regardless of what you think, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I know that biology works. I understand that biology very well, but what the pharmaceutical industry and what the nonprofits like the Gates Foundation and EcoHealth Alliance don't want you to know is that vaccines aren't as simple as making a weakened form of the virus and then injecting it in people and having them make antibodies so that they're immune to it. It's not that simple. And how do we know it's not that simple? Well, we've been trying to come up with a vaccine for the AIDS virus for a very long time. We've been trying to come up with a vaccine for respiratory coronaviruses for a very long time, because since SARS broke out, we have been fighting it, and we're fighting its reemergence. And so the concept that now with this novel coronavirus we suddenly have the motivation and the tools and the know-how to just push it through in 10 months, well, that sales pitch only works on somebody who doesn't have any clue as to where the state of the art stands. And that's what this ride is about. I mean, you need to understand where the state of the art is with regard to coronavirus vaccines. SARS and MERS are coronaviruses that are much more deadly than the current COVID-19 coronavirus. Much more deadly, like orders of magnitude, like 1% versus 20%. So we've been trying very hard to make a vaccine for SARS and MERS. And to a certain extent, we've had some success. But one thing that we learned from MERS and SARS was that, in general, when you get infected with these viruses, you make antibodies against these viruses. The immune system works, surprise, surprise, right? And it works just like they'd expect it to. And interestingly enough, they're now talking very much in the news about convalescent plasma therapy, and all that is taking plasma from somebody who has already recovered, and just that plasma is full of antibodies, and so you use that plasma to help you get through it. Essentially, you artificially raise your antibody level to an extremely high level, like you had already recovered, and then while your body is trying to fight off the disease, you just help it out with some convalescent plasma from somebody else who's got a lot of those antibodies, and voila, you make it through alive. Now, convalescent plasma therapy has one very big drawback, and that is you can't make any money off of it. Listen to that again, because this is what this whole story is about. All the people who are pushing for vaccines, they already know that we don't need a vaccine. Our immune system and the way that it learns is, generally speaking, the best system through which we should work to find a cure. Now, this comes with a caveat, and it also has to do with vaccination. But we learned already a long time ago that under certain conditions, somebody who has had or been exposed to a virus can sometimes, upon second exposure, develop a much more severe reaction to it. And actually, this story started with dengue fever, because when they were vaccinating people for dengue fever, what they noticed was that children who were exposed through their mom via, breast milk or something, and then would get a second variant of dengue fever, would develop this weird shock. Dengue shock, I think they called it. But it was like a super acute hyper reaction to dengue fever, full of autoimmunity and allergic reaction. Cytokine storms is what they call it now, I think. These are probably equivalent. I don't know that off the top of my head on the bike right now, but I think these are roughly equivalent. They're highly allergic reactions to the second exposure of the virus, and that's not how the immune system is supposed to work. But it turns out that this kind of antibody-dependent enhancement is especially seen during vaccination challenges. When you use, for example, a formaldehyde-weakened virus or an adjuvicated virus through some other chemical method, that's typically what a virus vaccine would be. And yet we've seen with a number of different of these applications in animals and in other organisms that this kind of weakened virus can cause or set an animal up for antibody-dependent enhancement in the second infection. We've seen this in felines, we've seen it with HIV and lentiviruses, we've seen it with mouse coronaviruses and mouse viruses. There's another virus of the mice that goes into the brain. So this is not a new idea, it's not a new concept. We've known about it for a while. But again, this is why there is not a vaccine for SARS yet. This is why we are not just vaccinating people for SARS and MERS all around the world, because there's no goddamn vaccine for it. And we don't necessarily have any great ideas for how to get around it. And so here's where the story gets interesting. Because earlier this decade, it was suggested that we could use the common cold, because we never really developed full immunity to it. We might be able to use the common cold virus, which is a coronavirus, to carry multiple genes and act as a multi-gene vaccine. So the idea would be that you would put these interesting epitopes, like an AIDS-specific epitope, AIDS virus-specific epitope on a coronavirus, and then when people got this common cold, in addition to developing antibodies like that for the common cold, they would instead develop antibodies for the epitopes presented by the coronavirus, engineered to vaccinate you against whatever they express on the outside of this virus. Now I want you to let that sink in. They've been researching this idea for a decade already. And how have they been doing it? Because the researchers themselves tell you that we could never have come up with these sequences. Nature is much better than we are. And that's exactly what they've been doing for 10 years. They've been collecting coronaviruses from the wild, everywhere they can be found, including bats and pangolins and mice and civets and everywhere. And then they've been taking these viruses and recombining them to find out what the different parts do and how those different parts might be harnessed to create a relatively novel coronavirus, but then with special epitopes on it that might be more useful to us and less useful for virulence or infection or mortality. So again, the reason why I'm so angry about people in social media and on the TV speculating about this being a weapon and saying that this thing was made to kill, it's just stupid. It's stupid rhetoric, because there's a much easier explanation. It was just hubris and naivety and arrogance. Just the act of collecting 800 or 1,000 viruses from the wild, purifying them and sequencing them was already relatively dangerous. And I understand that there were good reasons to do it, and I agree with those reasons. But it doesn't change the fact that these viral libraries exist, and these chimeric viruses exist en masse. There are hundreds of papers describing various chimeric methods to reconstitute and even to point mutate these in a controlled fashion to explore the function of particular parts of their spike protein or particular parts of their enzymatic genome. And so then to go on TV and just deny that we could have never come up with this, to deny very specifically that we could have never come up with this sequence, to me is a very obvious admission that we could have made the virus and that this could be a bioaccident. I think this is the most likely result of misguided pipe dream vaccine research. That's my theory. That's what I think is the most parsimonious explanation for what's going on right now. Excuse me. Now, the reason why this gets tricky is because SARS is already known to bind CD209, which is an immune cell receptor. And so SARS-CoV-2 could also do that. And then the next worst thing is that how this antibody dependent enhancement works is that the antibody attaches to the virus, and it can do a couple things. It can change the conformation of the spike protein, and that can allow it to enter different cells in theory. And it can also attach to the spike protein and then cooperate with the spike protein in a sort of antibody spike protein complex that results in the antibody being able to open other cells for the virus that its own spike protein wouldn't have opened. And so that's much creepier. So if you combine this with the known facts that SARS tends to go elsewhere than the ACE2 receptor in the lungs, because it can be in circulation and therefore it can go through the epithelia of the brain, blood-brain barrier, and get into the brain. And coronaviruses have also been in the past to show neurotrophic effects, and this might be the reason why in the extreme scenarios breathing is dysregulated. It's exceedingly rare, but it does happen apparently. It could be the reason why people face plant on the pavement. But another very distinct possibility about face planting comes from antibody dependent enhancement. It could be that a lot of these people in Wuhan were previously exposed to SARS, and being previously exposed to SARS may have set them up for antibody dependent enhancement of the COVID-19 infection. This could also explain what happened in Wuhan, or why it may appear later on that it was so much more deadly there, or that people are still being reinfected there. And that could be a preview for what we will see, I don't know. But good news is that the studies that have used convalescent plasma therapy seem to be working well. And that's the trick. Not all antibodies that your body will make will result in antibody-dependent enhancement. We can hope that in a normal scenario, most of them will not. Most of them will result in decreased viral activity and increased viral elimination and decreased viral load. That's what you'd hope. And that seems to be the case for most people. Again, just like an average respiratory virus pandemic that we have every year. But now, maybe it's special. But I can say, in my opinion, that it's not special if it came from nature. Then it's going to be gone, and we don't need to change anything, just like we didn't change anything after MERS or after SARS. And the only argument that you're going to be able to make to me that this coronavirus is more dangerous than any other respiratory virus that we've been co-evolving with for millions of years. The only way you're going to convince me of that is if somebody admits that this was laboratory generated. It was generated in a way that nature would never have done. If you're putting pieces together that would never meet in nature, then we could have a kind of gain of function that deviates from the typical coronavirus respiratory infection. And then Knut's wrong. And then all of them are wrong. And we'll see it very soon. Maybe in 2 weeks, we can know. We just have to keep paying attention. That's the trick. So thanks for joining me on that ride. That was a little bit of a free discussion about vaccines and antibodies and immunity and what we can expect moving forward with the coronavirus pandemic. The points that I'm really trying to make here are that vaccination is not as simple as what they may have presented it to you in grade school biology. And indeed, we've learned a lot about vaccination in the last 50 years as we've vaccinated more and more people and been able to see the rare effects of the vaccination in large populations. And those rare effects are actually quite deadly. A lot of them are quite understood now, and antibody-dependent enhancement is one of those things that we understand quite well. We learned it first from dengue fever, but we've seen it with a lot of other diseases, including measles and feline immunodeficiency virus and HIV. So going forward, what we need to realize as a population is that while these various firms and nonprofits are trying to sell the idea that they're going to make a vaccine for this virus in, let's say, 11 months or a year and a half, we need to understand that these same people have been busy trying to make a SARS coronavirus vaccine since about 2003. And so far, they haven't made very much progress. In lieu of progress, what they've done is that they've cataloged and combined as many coronaviruses from from nature as they possibly could find. They've grown them in the laboratory, and then by chimerically combining them, they've been trying to study how the different pieces, the different enzymes, the different structural proteins, how they contribute to viral virulence, how they contribute to viral load, and how they contribute to the interaction with the immune system of the host. We've been doing this for decades. And so we need to understand and come to the realization that vaccination for coronaviruses is not a very simple prospect. And in fact, we have a decade of science that shows us that this is not a very simple task. And so we need to be ready to accept the fact that just like many other respiratory viruses, the only way out may be our own biology. And I'm not really afraid of trusting our own biology, because our own biology has been honed by millions of years of evolution in coexistence with viruses. So join me for the ride. There's a couple neat concepts that I think everybody will benefit from understanding and benefit moving forward, being able to interpret the words that come out of the various puppets that are on the TV. We can interpret these words better once we understand their true motivations and the true sort of gray area that is vaccinations for these modern pandemic viruses. Thanks for joining me. If you liked it, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on JC on a Bike.